March 1944. Occupied Paris. The Bf-109 ahead of was running, and it was running toward the most famous landmark in occupied Europe. Don't follow them down. The briefing was 3 days ago. Same room, same map, same instructor's voice. If they go for the deck, you let them go. The city will kill you faster than any German pilot. Didn't let him go. The Bf-109G was maybe 400 yards out, both aircraft below 500 feet and dropping. The rooftops of Paris moved under them at 350, chimneys, water towers, the gray geometry of boulevards, every object a fixed point, every fixed point a potential end. The German pilot knew this city. He had the advantage. He knew, had always known, that Americans stopped here. Did not stop. Before that morning, the math was simple. German pilots dove for the deck and they walked away. American pilots who followed them over European cities did not walk away. The tactic had a success rate that made it doctrine, not written doctrine, the other kind. The kind that stays alive because it keeps working. In the months before this mission, American fighters lost engagements to Bf-109s that simply went low and let the city do the work. After this morning, one German pilot was going to discover something nobody had told him. Below 2,000 feet, his DB-605 engine was losing horsepower at 400 feet per minute of descent. The Merlin 450 yards behind him was not. The tower was visible from 3 miles. The German saw it. He had a plan. It was a good plan. It was the wrong plan. In March 1944, the 8th Air Force was running deep penetration missions over the Reich at a pace that was killing pilots faster than the training pipeline could replace them. The 357th Fighter Group had arrived at RAF, Suffolk, in February. By March, they were flying escort over France and Germany. The sky over occupied Europe was not neutral territory. It belonged to pilots who had been fighting in it since 1940. The Bf-109G, was the standard German interceptor over the Western Front. By 1944, it had been in continuous combat development for 4 years. The DB-605 engine produced 1,455 horsepower at its critical altitude of 18,700 feet. At medium altitudes between 8,000 and 18,000 feet, there was a machine built for killing. Tight turning radius, aggressive climb rate. A pilot who knew it could take it vertical and leave most Allied fighters behind. German aces had built their kill counts on exactly that sequence: bait, climb, reverse, fire. The low-altitude escape was the other tool. Below 500 feet over hostile terrain, the arithmetic of aerial combat changed. The pursuing pilot had to manage his aircraft, his speed, and the ground simultaneously. He had to know the terrain or guess it. He had to decide in fractions of a second which obstacles were survivable and which were not. The defender had already made those calculations before he dove. He chose the route. He set the terms. The pursuer reacted. USAAF instructions were explicit. Do not pursue enemy aircraft over built-up areas at low altitude. The language was careful. The meaning was not. If a German pilot went for the deck over a city, you let him go. The tactic had a success rate that made it doctrine. Not written doctrine in the way a field manual is doctrine. The other kind, the kind that survives because it keeps working, because pilots who ignored it died and pilots who followed it landed. German pilots knew the instruction existed. They flew against it deliberately. Attempt 1. The climbs. Standard zoom maneuver, a German staple since the Battle of Britain. The sequence was practiced and reliable. Convert speed to altitude in a near-vertical pull, reach the apex with enough energy to reverse, come back down onto the pursuer's 6 o'clock with position and gravity working together. Against most Allied fighters in 1943, it worked consistently. The DB-605 at 8,000 to 12,000 feet had the climb rate to make the angle. The pursuer, if he followed, bled speed on the way up and arrived at the top slow, flat and exposed. Against it did not work. The P-51B's horizontal speed at the altitudes where this engagement began the Bf-109, the angle separation it needed to pull the maneuver cleanly. The German reached the apex of the climb. The Mustang was still inside 500 yards. He came back down without position. The geometry had not changed in his favor. Attempt 2. Horizontal sprint above 5,000 feet. The DB-605 at that altitude was running below its first critical height of 8,200 feet, but still inside a workable power band, approximately 1,200 horsepower, enough to sustain a competitive top speed in level flight. The German pilot ran west, then turned, using the horizontal plane where the Bf-109's narrow fuselage and clean drag profile gave it a chance. At these altitudes, on a straight heading, the performance gap between the two aircraft was narrow enough that a German pilot with a lead could hold it. Held the pursuit. The gap did not open. After 90 seconds of horizontal sprint, the Bf-109 had not extended to safe distance and had burned fuel running a profile that was not closing the engagement. The German needed a different card. Attempt 3, the deck. The German pilot pushed the nose down and pointed it at Paris. It was the move that had ended dozens of pursuits across France and Germany. The calculus was always the same. No confirmed kill was worth flying a P-51 at 355 between Parisian apartment blocks at 200 feet. The German pilot had made this calculation before he dove. He had probably made it in other engagements. He had survived those engagements. The tactic worked because the fear it exploited was rational. The city would kill a careless pursuer faster than any Bf-109 could. What the tactic did not account for was the supercharger. The DB-605 ran a single-stage, two-speed mechanical supercharger. At its second critical altitude of 18,700 feet, it produced 1,455 horsepower. At its first critical altitude of 8,200 feet, it produced enough to be competitive. Below 2,000 feet, it produced approximately 1,050 horsepower. The loss was not a cliff. It was a gradient, steady, continuous, invisible on the instruments unless a pilot knew to look for it in the way his speed stopped building when the throttle said it should. German pilots who used the deck as an escape route were not trained to look for it. The deck was an escape route. It was not a combat altitude. The engine's behavior there was not a tactical variable. It was wallpaper. The V-1650-3 and P-51B ran a two-stage, two-speed supercharger. At 23,000 feet, it reached its second critical altitude and made 1,380 horsepower. Below 9,500 feet, it shifted to the first stage. And below 2,000 feet, in the zone the German pilot was treating as sanctuary, the Merlin held boost pressure the DB-605 could not match. At deck altitude, the P-51B was running 1,300 to 1,380 horsepower against the Bf-109's 1,050. The speed differential ran 55 to 65 in its favor. The aircraft running from him was slower than the aircraft chasing him, and neither pilot could read that number off a gauge. One of them would feel it in the mirror. The other would feel it in the throttle that had nowhere left to go. The German pilot dove into a trap he had constructed himself. The physics were set before either aircraft crossed 500 feet. Did not know the exact numbers. He knew the aircraft. He knew the Merlin did not die at the bottom. First Lieutenant William B. Jr. was 23 years old. He had grown up in Clifton Forge, Virginia, a railroad town in the mountains, population under 5,000. He was not the top scorer in the 363rd Fighter Squadron. He was not the pilot the group would have selected to demonstrate a new tactical principle. He was the pilot who happened to be on that Bf-109's tail on that morning over Paris, and who did not turn away when the German went low. That is the only biography that matters here. The tower was visible ahead of both aircraft. The German pilot was pointing at it. He had a reason. The tower at ground level is not a landmark. It is 4 iron legs planted in the Champ Mars, each leg the size of a building, each angled inward toward a point 1,063 feet above the grass. The arches between the legs are open. The clearance at the base runs approximately 50 feet of usable airspace before the iron latticework closes in. The span between the southwest and southeast legs, the approach axis the German pilot chose, is wide enough for 2 aircraft flying in trail at 350. Wide enough and not much wider than that. At 350, the P-51B covers 513 feet every second. The total usable width of the lower arch is roughly 200 feet. The aircraft passes through it in under half a second. There is no time to correct a line that is slightly off. There is no time to reconsider. The only way through is to already be on the right line before the tower fills the windscreen, to have committed the alignment before the geometry of the opening becomes fully visible, to trust that the hands have done the calculation the mind has not finished making. The German pilot knew this. He had aligned for it before the Champ Mars opened up. He chose this exit. Was 400 yards back when the tower appeared at the end of the boulevard. At 350, 400 yards collapses in 2.3 seconds. There was no decision point remaining. The decision had been made somewhere over the Seine, when the Doctrine said pull up and did not pull up. What remained now was arithmetic and execution, and the Merlin running at full power 3 feet behind his shoulders. He held the line. The tower arrived. T+0. The Bf-109G crosses below 300 feet over the Seine, West Bank. Both aircraft above the river at approximately 355. The DB-605 dropped below its first critical altitude, 8,200 feet, several minutes ago. The power loss since that crossing has been continuous and invisible. It does not register on any cockpit instrument as a gradient. It registers only as an aircraft that will not accelerate when the throttle says it should. T+1 minute. The 7th arrondissement is on both sides. At 200 feet, the rooflines run above cockpit level. Paris, at street level in March 1944, had learned to clear the streets when aircraft came low. The boulevard below them is empty. The German threads between the buildings on a routing he has chosen, or the routing that presented itself, the corridor that leads where he needs it to lead, follows the Bf-109's tail and nothing else. The buildings are peripheral. The tail is the only fixed point in the windscreen that matters. The DB-605 at this altitude is producing approximately 1,150 horsepower. The V-1650-3, 1,340 horsepower. The gap between the two aircraft is not closing yet. It is not opening either. T+2 minutes. The Champ Mars opens at the end of the boulevard. The open ground runs 900 yards from the river's edge to the base of the tower. The German drops to 80 feet above the grass. At this altitude and this speed, 900 yards passes in under 5 seconds. He is already aligned. The approach to the arch requires a specific track, not centered on the tower but offset toward the gap between the southwest and southeast legs, where the clearance is widest and the iron of the lattice are highest above the ground. A pilot who has looked at the tower knows which gap to use. The German knows. 350 yards back sees the alignment. He sees where the Bf-109 is pointed. He adjusts his own track to match it. At 350 yards and 355, he has 2 seconds before the German enters the arch and 4 seconds before he reaches it himself. His left hand does not come off the throttle. His right hand holds the stick on the line. The tower fills the top third of the windscreen, and the grass fills the bottom third, and the arch is the only usable space between them. T+3 minutes. The Bf-109G enters the arch. The iron legs are on both sides. The Champ Mars is 50 feet below the belly. The span is 200 feet. The wingspan is 32 feet. The clearance on each side is 84 feet. The aircraft is through the opening in half a second. The tower is behind the German pilot before the sound of the slipstream through the lattice has finished reaching him. He is through open ground ahead, the river, the 15th arrondissement beyond it. The American is still behind the tower. T+330 enters the arch. The P-51B's wingspan is 37 feet. The clearance narrows to 81 feet on each side. The Champ Mars is 50 feet below. The Merlin does not miss a beat. The manifold pressure holds. The throttle position does not change. The aircraft moves through the opening at 355, and the tower is behind him before the mind has finished registering what the hands have done. The cockpit of a P-51B at 50 feet and 355 is not loud in the way that word usually means. It is total. The engine vibration runs through the airframe into the rudder pedals and the stick and the seat pan without interruption. At low altitude, the cockpit runs warmer than at altitude. No cold soak from the upper air. No icing on the canopy edges. The smell is hydraulic fluid and exhaust and the particular sharp quality of an engine running at the edge of its envelope. His oxygen mask was down. At 50 feet, he did not need it. His field of view through the gun sight was the Bf-109 tail, the grass, the sky above the river. The tower was behind him before he had time to think about the tower. He came out of the arch, and the Champ Mars was gone, and the Bf-109 was ahead, and the geometry had not changed in the Germans' favor. The other P-51s from the 363rd Fighter Squadron were somewhere above. Not hundreds of feet above. The mission altitude for escort work that day put the rest of the squadron in a different world. At 8,000 feet, the Champ Mars is a green rectangle, and the tower is a spike, and the Seine is a line, and two aircraft at 50 feet are invisible against the city's texture, indistinguishable from the rooftops around them. The radio traffic was standard. Position calls, altitude checks, the compressed procedural language of men managing a large volume of sky, bogey calls, vectors, the word tally when someone had a visual. Nobody on the frequency was at 50 feet. Nobody on the frequency had a tally on. The combat net did not carry the information that one P-51B from the 363rd had just passed through the base of the tower at 355, in pursuit of a BF-109 that had run out of places to go. That information would reach the frequency eventually, in the debrief room in the intelligence officer's notes, in the after-action report that went up the chain of command. On the radio in real time, there was nothing. Was not on the radio. He was watching the gap close. The German pilot came through the arch, and the tower was behind him, and the Champ Mars fell away, and he pressed the throttle, and the throttle was already at the forward stop. He had pushed it there before the river. He had held it through the boulevard, through the alignment, through the arch. The DB-605 was at full power. Full power at this altitude was what it was, approximately 1,050 horsepower, and the engine was giving all of it, and the gap was not opening. He looked in the mirror. The P-51B was through the arch, 300 yards back. He had come through the one place that ended pursuits. He had threaded it cleanly, and the American had followed him through it, and now there was flat ground ahead, and a river and the city on both sides, and nothing between them but distance that was not growing. He pushed the throttle again. A physical push, the push of a hand on something that has run out of travel. The DB-605 answered with everything it had. Everything it had was not enough. The Mustang behind him was running an engine that had more power at this altitude than his did, and he had no way to know that, and his throttle had no more positions, and the gap was closing. He had 20 seconds. T plus 4 minutes. The power differential is 300 horsepower. At deck altitude that converts to 55 to 65 of speed advantage for the P-51B, the BF-109G is not accelerating. It cannot accelerate. The equation does not change. It only resolves. Is inside 250 yards. The BF-109 fills the gun sight. At this range, the deflection is minimal. 4 times 50 caliber M2 Browning carried in the wings fires at 850 rounds per minute per gun. At 250 yards, the rounds cover the distance in under a tenth of a second. T plus 430 opens fire. The German pilot, name unrecorded in surviving USAAF documents, unit unconfirmed, age unknown, does not bring the aircraft home. The combat report filed at RAF that evening is 11 lines long. Enemy aircraft engaged over Paris, pursued to low altitude over city. Aircraft destroyed in vicinity of tower area. The language is standard. The result is not. The tower was supposed to end the pursuit. It ended the BF-109. Landed at RAF with no battle damage. The P-51B touched down on the same runway it had left that morning. The ground crew met it on they checked the gun ports. 4 50 caliber barrels fired. They checked the airframe. No holes. No hydraulic fluid on the belly. No structural damage from the arch, from the rooftops, from the 50 feet of clearance over the Champ Mars. The aircraft was intact. The debrief ran longer than standard. The intelligence officer wrote down what told him. The report went up the chain. The distinguished flying cross citation that came back down did not mention the tower. It did not mention the arch. It did not mention 50 feet of clearance at 355 over the grass of the Champ Mars. The citation used the language all DFC citations used, distinguished himself by extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight. Enemy aircraft destroyed in the vicinity of Paris. The specifics of how the enemy aircraft came to be in that vicinity, at that altitude, and why was behind it rather than above it, none of that made it into the formal language of the award. The document said, enemy aircraft destroyed. It did not say, because the Merlin maintains boost pressure below 2,000 feet and the DB-605 does not. 1 German pilot, 1 BF-109G numbers that do not move the needle on a strategic balance sheet for March 1944, when the 8th Air Force was losing aircraft over the Reich by the dozen. But the combat report that filed that evening circulated through the 363rd Fighter Squadron and beyond it. Pilots read after-action reports. They read them the way men read anything that tells them how to stay alive. The report said, pursued Bf-109 to deck altitude over Paris. Merlin maintained power. Enemy aircraft could not extend. Destroyed. How many pilots read that report and filed it away in a folder in memory and came home because of it cannot be calculated. The number is not zero. USAAF Fighter Command updated its tactical guidance in 1944. The language that had discouraged pursuit at low altitude over built-up areas did not disappear. The danger it described was real and remained real. But alongside it, in the revised fighter tactics documentation circulated to groups in the 8th Air Force, a different principle appeared. The Merlin's two-stage supercharger maintained combat power at altitudes where German single-stage engines degraded. Below 2,000 feet, the performance relationship between the P-51B and the Bf-109G inverted. The aircraft that appeared to be escaping was, in mechanical terms, slowing down. Pilots who knew this flew differently. The low-altitude escape route that German pilots had used since the Battle of Britain became something else, a corridor where the Bf-109 lost 400 horsepower and the Mustang behind it did not. The exact directive number is held in NARA Record Group 18. The principle it encoded is not complicated. Know where your engine works. Know where his doesn't. The geography of that difference is where the engagement ends. After the war, American intelligence teams worked through captured Luftwaffe records and conducted systematic debriefs of German fighter pilots. The interrogation files, NARA T-77, Luftwaffe records, documented a consistent pattern in how German pilots described low-altitude combat against P-51s in the second half of 1944. The accounts varied in detail. The conclusion ran through all of them. American pilots stopped breaking off at the deck. German pilots who dove for sanctuary found the Mustangs following them down, and following them faster than the Doctrine said was possible. One captured Luftwaffe pilot described it in his debrief as fighting an aircraft that got better when you expected it to get worse. He was describing the Merlin. He did not know the engineering term for what he had experienced. He knew the result. The Royal Aircraft Establishment and USAAF test pilots had known the engineering term since comparative engine trials in 1943 and 1944. The two-stage supercharger maintained manifold pressure through the descent profile that single-stage engines could not follow. The DB-605 lost boost. The Merlin held it. At deck altitude, the power numbers crossed, and the aircraft behind became the faster aircraft, and the pilot running did not know why his throttle had stopped working. The technical reports from those trials, RAE and USAAF documents, available through the National Archives in and NARA, were not classified for long. They fed directly into post-war engine design. Every supercharged and turbocharged aircraft engine built after 1945 carries the same logic in its architecture. Staging the compression solves the altitude problem. You do not accept the power curve as fixed. You build a system that fights the curve at every altitude band. The Whitney F-100 PW220 that powers the F-16C does not use a mechanical supercharger. It uses a multi-stage axial compressor feeding a turbofan core. The principle is not identical to the Merlin's two-stage setup. The principle is not different either. The engine maintains thrust at low altitude through staged compression of intake air. An F-16 at 200 feet over flat terrain is not running a degraded engine. It is running the engine it was designed to run, full thrust, full authority. When an F-16 pursues a target at deck altitude and does not break off, it is using an engine that solved the same problem the Merlin solved in 1943. The aircraft that appears to be escaping is not pulling away. The geometry resolves. The engagement ends. The physics do not change. The hardware that exploits them gets smaller, lighter, more precise. The logic is 80 years old and it runs in every tactical aircraft flying today. At the USAF Weapons School at AFB, the foundational framework for fighter employment is built around energy management, the relationship between altitude, speed, and engine output at every point in the flight envelope. Instructors call it the energy maneuverability diagram. The concept formalizes what demonstrated empirically over the Champ Mars. Performance is not a fixed number on a specification sheet. It is a function of altitude, and the pilot who understands that function at every point in the envelope has an aircraft that is different from the one his enemy thinks he is flying. The photograph of the P-51B near the tower is held at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. The 357th Fighter Group Association preserved the veteran accounts before they were gone. Died on 29 October 2013. He was 92 years old. He worked as a civil engineer after the war. He built bridges and roads in Virginia. He gave interviews when people asked. In those interviews, when he described what happened over Paris, he did not describe it as a tactical revelation. He described it as a pursuit. He was behind the German. He stayed behind the German. The Merlin did what it was built to do. The German believed low altitude would save him. The Merlin proved otherwise. Landed with a confirmed kill and no battle damage.